The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled like magic. The big chandeliers were full of shiny crystals, and the golden light made everything look like a fairy tale. Fancy people in beautiful clothes filled the room, talking and laughing. In the middle of it all was Evan Grant. Evan was a young man, 28 years old, with sharp blue eyes and neat brown hair. He looked fancy in his perfect suit, but inside he felt nervous. He kept glancing at the shiny silver watch his dad had given him. He was thinking about the big expectations everyone had for him. "Where's your fiancée?" His mom, Evelyn Grant, asked with a stiff smile, her bright red lipstick making her look serious. "She should be here soon, Mom," Evan answered, trying to stay calm, but inside, he was worried. Sophie, his fiancée, was never late. Just then, the big doors of the ballroom opened. Sophie Smith walked in, wearing a beautiful green dress that shimmered as she moved. Her brown skin glowed, and her kind brown eyes looked both happy and scared. Evan's heart raced when he saw her, but he could tell something was wrong. Sophie walked straight to him and whispered, "Evan, we need to talk." Her voice was shaky. Evan took her to a quieter corner of the room, away from the crowd. "What's wrong, Jan?" he asked. Sophie took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant, Evan," she said. Evan's world froze. He felt like the ground had disappeared under his feet. "Pregnant?" The word echoed in his head. He felt scared, surprised, and even a little happy, though he quickly pushed that feeling away. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Sophie nodded, tears in her eyes. "I took the test 3 times. Evan, I know we didn't plan this, but..." Evan interrupted her, panic creeping in. "We can't have this baby, Jan. Not now. My career is just starting, and we had so many plans." Sophie's face changed. She looked determined. "This is our baby, Evan. Our child." But Evan wasn't listening anymore. His mind was full of scary thoughts. Newspapers writing about them, his parents' angry faces, and all the things he thought he'd lose. "I need some air," he muttered and walked away. He hurried through the ballroom, ignoring his mom's questions and the guests' curious stares. Outside, the cold air of New York City hit his face. He looked up at the sky, but there were no stars, just the city lights. His perfect life, his perfect plans felt like they were crumbling. Then, Evan made a decision. He wouldn't go back to the ballroom. He wouldn't talk to Sophie or face his parents. He'd run away from everything. He hailed a yellow cab and climbed inside. As the cab drove off, Evan told himself he'd fix things one day when he was ready. Back in the ballroom, Sophie waited, but Evan didn't return. The guests started leaving, whispering behind her back. Sophie stood there, alone, one hand on her belly. She realized the truth. Evan wasn't coming back. Evelyn Grant, Evan's mom, approached her. "Dear, maybe you should go home. Evan will talk to you when he's ready." But Sophie saw no kindness in Evelyn's eyes, only relief. With tears, she refused to cry. Sophie left the ballroom. As she walked through the busy streets of New York, she made a promise to the baby growing inside her. She would love and protect her child no matter what. 5 years passed. Morning light shone through the small window of an apartment in Brooklyn. Sophie, now 32, woke up to the sound of little feet running across the floor. "Mommy, wake up!" Leo, her 4-year-old son, called out excitedly. "I'm awake, sweetie." "What's the rush?" Sophie asked, smiling. "Today's the talent show at school. Remember?" Leo said, bouncing with excitement. "How could I forget?" Sophie laughed, sitting up and hugging him tightly. Leo had curly hair and bright brown eyes, just like his dad. Sophie's heart ached a little, but she pushed the thought of Evan away. As they ate breakfast, Sophie watched Leo practicing his song for the talent show. She felt so proud. Their apartment was small, but it was cozy and filled with love. On one wall hung Leo's colorful drawings. In the corner was an old piano Sophie bought secondhand. Leo loved to play it, and Sophie encouraged him every day. "Time to get ready for school," Sophie called. On the way to school, they passed the community center where Sophie worked. "Mom, can I come with you after school?" Leo asked. "Of course, sweetheart. We're having a fun painting class today, Sophie said, holding his hand. At school, she knelt to look him in the eye. Remember, it's not about winning. Just have fun and do your best. I will, Mommy, Leo said, giving her a big hug before running inside. At the community center, Sophie worked hard. She had become a leader in the neighborhood, helping kids discover their love for art. That day, she shared her idea for a big talent show to raise money for the center. Everyone loved it. When Leo came to the center after school, he couldn't stop talking. Mom, my teacher said I'm the best pianist in class. Sophie hugged him tightly. I'm so proud of you. She felt a pang in her heart, thinking of Evan and how much he was missing. Later that night, as Leo slept, Sophie stood by the window. She thought about how her life had changed. From a rich fiancé in Manhattan to a single mom in Brooklyn, it wasn't the life she dreamed of, but it was a good life. She had love and purpose. Far away in a fancy apartment in Manhattan, Evan Grant woke up early. His life looked perfect, expensive furniture, famous paintings, and a view of the city. But Evan felt empty. He had become the youngest CEO of his dad's company, but something was missing. As he got ready for work, he thought about the choices he had made. He had run away from Sophie and their baby. Now, even though he had everything money could buy, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something far more precious. Mr. Grant, your coffee is ready, said a voice from the intercom. It was Olivia, his assistant. Thank you, Olivia. I'll be there in a minute, replied Evan Grant, adjusting his fancy tie in front of the mirror. When Evan went to the kitchen, his coffee was waiting for him, along with a big pile of newspapers and magazines. One magazine had his face on the cover under the title, Wall Street's Prodigy, How Evan Grant Changed the Financial Market. Evan picked it up and flipped through the pages while sipping his coffee. Words like brilliant, relentless, and genius jumped out at him. The magazine called him a success story, but Evan didn't feel happy. Instead, he felt empty. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his dad. Congrats on the Forbes cover, son. I always knew you'd be great. Don't forget the board meeting later. Evan sighed. His dad couldn't even say, I'm proud of you. But he wasn't surprised. His dad had always wanted him to win, to be the best. Love and kindness were never part of the deal. When Evan got to his office, everyone congratulated him. People smiled, shook his hand, and told him how amazing he was. Evan thanked them with a fake smile, feeling like he was in a dream. Here's your schedule for today, Olivia said, handing him a list of meetings and tasks. Evan nodded and went to his office. When the door shut, he let out a long sigh. The view from his glass window was incredible, showing all of New York City. It was a city he had conquered, yet he felt like he didn't belong there. The morning was busy. Evan went through meetings, phone calls, and huge decisions worth millions of dollars. He did it all perfectly, like a robot. But deep inside, something didn't feel right. During his lunch break, Evan sat alone in his office. His eyes drifted to a locked drawer in his desk. Slowly, he opened it and took out an old photo. It showed a young woman named Sophie smiling and hugging him. Both of them looked so happy. The photo was taken a long time ago, before everything went wrong. Evan touched the picture, feeling sad and guilty. Mr. Grant, your father is here for the board meeting, Olivia's voice said over the intercom. Evan quickly put the photo away. Thanks, Olivia. I'll be there in a moment. He fixed his tie and practiced a confident look before heading to the meeting. But as he walked down the hall, he wondered, was all this success worth what I gave up? The meeting was tense. Evan presented the company's results, which were amazing. But the cold, serious faces of the board members reminded him that success never lasts for long. At the end of the meeting, his father, Maxwell Grant, pulled him aside. Good work today, Evan, but don't get lazy. The market is tough, and we need to stay ahead, his father said. Evan nodded, swallowing the words he wanted to say. Yes, Dad, I'll keep working hard. That night, Evan went home to his big, fancy apartment. It was quiet and lonely. He poured himself a drink and stood by the window looking out at the city lights. He had everything he ever wanted: money, fame, and power. But as he stared at the view, he wondered if he had lost something more important. With a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and searched for a name: Sophie Smith. His finger hovered over the search button, shaking a little. Evan, the man everyone thought was fearless, was now afraid of facing his past. At a small school called Betty Primary, the auditorium was full of kids and parents. It was talent show night, and everyone was excited. In a tiny dressing room, Sophie was fixing her son Leo's bow tie. "You're going to do great," she said, kneeling down to look into his eyes. "No matter what happens, I'm so proud of you." Leo nodded, smiling nervously. "I'll play it just like we practiced, Mom." Sophie smiled back, her heart full of love. Watching Leo reminded her of Evan, his dad. Moments like this made her miss having a father figure for Leo, but she pushed those thoughts away. Outside, a fancy car parked quietly. Evan stepped out, fixing his tie. He had spent days gathering the courage to come here. He didn't know what he was hoping for, but something in his heart told him he needed to be here. Inside, the talent show started. Kids sang, danced, and performed plays. Everyone clapped and cheered, but Sophie was only thinking about Leo. Finally, it was his turn. "And now Leo Smith will play Beethoven's Clair de Lune on the piano," the host announced. The crowd murmured. It was a hard song for someone so young. Leo walked up to the piano, his small fingers ready on the keys. In the back of the room, Evan froze. He heard the name Leo Smith, and a wave of emotions hit him. Leo began to play. The soft, beautiful notes filled the room. The audience sat still, completely amazed. Leo's fingers moved gracefully, playing with a skill far beyond his years. Sophie, sitting in the front row, couldn't hold back her tears. Every note reminded her of the sacrifices she had made for Leo. At the back, Evan's heart pounded. He watched the boy, his son, feeling proud and sad all at once. When the song ended, the crowd clapped loudly. Leo stood and bowed, his face glowing with joy. Sophie rushed onto the stage, hugging him tightly. "You were amazing," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." "I did it, Mom," Leo said, his smile as bright as the stage lights. From the back, Evan watched them. He wanted to go to them, to say something, to fix everything, but he was frozen in place. As the crowd began to leave, Sophie and Leo walked off the stage, talking with friends. Then Sophie looked up and saw Evan. Their eyes met. Time seemed to stop. All the memories, all the pain hung between them. Leo noticed his mom's expression. "Who's that man, Mom?" he asked. Sophie held his hand tightly. "No one important, sweetheart. Let's go celebrate your big night." She walked away, taking Leo with her. Evan stood there alone in the empty auditorium. The music still echoed in his ears. That night, while Sophie and Leo celebrated with dinner at home, Evan sat in his quiet apartment. He stared at an old photo of Sophie. With trembling hands, he picked up his phone and typed, "Sophie, I know I don't deserve it, but can we talk? Please. Evan." He stared at the message before finally pressing send. At home, Sophie saw her phone light up. She read Evan's message, her heart racing. She thought about ignoring it, but as she watched Leo sleeping peacefully, she knew she couldn't avoid the past forever. With a deep breath, she began to type her reply. Sophie Smith sat on a bench near the lake. Her fingers tapped nervously on her handbag, and her eyes kept looking around. She was waiting for someone. Soon, Evan Grant arrived. He was wearing a fancy suit which looked strange in the park. He stopped for a moment, then walked toward her, feeling nervous. "Hello, Sophie," he said quietly. Evan was usually confident, but this was hard for him. Sophie looked up at him. For a moment, she remembered a night long ago that still hurt her. "Evan," she said, her voice steady but careful. "Sit down." Evan sat on the bench but kept a little distance. The air between them felt heavy, filled with all the things they hadn't said to each other in years. You look nice," Evan said to break the silence. Sophie gave a small, tired smile. We're not here for compliments, Evan. Why did you want to meet me? Evan took a deep breath. I wanted to say sorry for what I did that night, for disappearing all these years. I know it's probably too late. Too late, Sophie interrupted, her voice shaking. You have no idea. You weren't there when I worried about paying rent. You weren't there when Leo took his first steps or said his first words. Evan hung his head, feeling ashamed. I know. I was a coward, Sophie. I don't have an excuse. No, you don't, Sophie said, but her voice was softer now. It's not just about me, Evan. It's about Leo, our son. Evan's face lit up. Leo, he repeated, a smile spreading across his face. He's amazing. I saw him at the talent show. He's got a real gift. Sophie's face softened, pride shining in her eyes. Yes, he does. He practices every day, even when I'm too tired to help. For the first time in years, they shared a moment of understanding. They both cared deeply for Leo. Sophie, Evan said slowly, I know I don't have the right to ask, but I want to meet him. I want to be in his life. Sophie closed her eyes and took a deep breath. When she opened them, she looked right at Evan. You can't just walk into his life like nothing happened. He's 5 years old, Evan. He has questions and feelings about the dad he's never met. Evan nodded. I understand. What do you want me to do? Take it slow, Sophie said firmly. I need to see that you're serious. I can't let Leo get attached to you if you're just going to leave again. I won't leave, Evan promised. I want to be there for him, for both of you. Sophie looked at him closely, searching his face. After a moment, she said, Okay, you can meet him, but only when I'm there too. We'll start with once a week. You can come to the park or help with his piano lessons. Evan agreed quickly. Yes, of course, whatever you think is best. As they talked, a man walked up to them. It was James, Sophie's childhood friend. He was like family to her now. Sophie, is everything okay? James asked, looking at Evan with suspicion. Sophie stood up and smiled at James. Everything's fine. James, this is Evan, Leo's dad. Evan, this is James, a very close friend. The two men shook hands, but it wasn't a friendly handshake. Evan felt jealous of how comfortable James seemed with Sophie. Well, Sophie said, trying to lighten the mood, I think we've decided everything for now. Evan, I'll call you to plan Leo's first meeting. Evan nodded, feeling sad to leave but thankful for the chance. Thank you, Sophie. I'll do my best. As Evan walked away, Sophie turned to James. Shall we go? Leo is waiting for his trip to the zoo. James smiled and put an arm around her shoulder. Of course. Are you sure you're okay with this? Sophie looked back at Evan, who was now far away. I'm not sure, James, but I have to try for Leo. They left together, ready to pick up Leo. Sophie felt nervous about the future, but also hopeful. Meanwhile, Evan went home. He stared out his apartment window and promised himself, Sophie, and Leo that he wouldn't fail this time. The next Sunday was sunny. Evan, now dressed in jeans and a casual shirt, waited nervously in the park. He had a small gift in his hands. He saw Sophie walking toward him, holding Leo's hand. Evan's heart raced. Sophie stopped in front of him and bent down to speak to Leo. Do you remember what I told you? This is Evan. He's your dad. Leo looked at Evan curiously but said nothing at first. Finally, he said softly, Hi. Evan knelt to Leo's level and smiled. Hi, Leo. It's so nice to meet you. After a short silence, Evan held out the gift. I brought something for you. Leo looked at Sophie. She nodded, so he opened it carefully. Inside was a book of beginner piano songs. I heard you love playing the piano, Evan explained. Maybe we can play these together sometime? Leo's eyes lit up. You play the piano too? Not as well as you, Evan said with a grin. I heard you at the talent show. You were amazing. Leo smiled shyly. Thanks. Mom helps me practice every day. Sophie, watching them, felt her emotions stir. Seeing Evan and Leo together felt strange, but also a little right. How about we play for a while, she suggested. The three of them went to the playground. Evan pushed Leo on the swings while Sophie watched carefully. Slowly, the nervousness faded. Leo started laughing and chatting with Evan about his favorite songs. While Leo was busy on the slide, Evan walked over to Sophie. He's wonderful, Evan said softly. You've done such a great job with him. Sophie smiled. He's my world. Every day, he surprises me. I know I've missed so much, Evan said, his voice serious. But I want to make it right. I want to be there for him from now on. Sophie studied him carefully. Actions speak louder than words, Evan, but I'm willing to give it a chance for Leo. Before they could say more, James appeared. Uncle James, Leo called, running to him. James hugged Leo but kept his eyes on Evan and Sophie. Is everything okay? He asked Sophie. Yes, Sophie said calmly. Evan and Leo are spending their first day together. James didn't seem happy but nodded. I just wanted to check on you. As the sun set, Evan said goodbye to Leo. I'll see you again soon, he promised. Leo hugged his piano book. Thanks, Dad. Sophie watched Evan leave, unsure of what the future would hold. But as Leo talked excitedly about his new songs, she felt a little more hopeful. For now, that was enough. Evan stood up, trying hard to look calm, even though he wasn't happy. No problem. I was just leaving, he said. Sophie, sensing that the room felt a little tense, quickly stepped in. James, you remember Evan, don't you? He's been helping Leo with his piano lessons. James nodded stiffly, his face serious. Of course. How are you, Evan? I'm fine, thanks, Evan said, his voice as chilly as James's. Leo, hearing voices thus, walked into the kitchen. His face lit up when he saw James. Uncle James, he shouted happily, running over to hug him. James's face softened and he smiled as he hugged Leo. Hey, champ, how was your piano lesson today? It was amazing, Leo said excitedly. Dad taught me a new song. The word dad hung in the air. Everyone noticed it. James's smile faded as he stiffened, while Evan allowed himself a tiny smile. Wanting to change the mood, Sophie spoke up. Honey, why don't you show Uncle James the new song you learned? Okay. Leo grabbed James's hand and pulled him toward the living room. Sophie turned back to Evan. I think we should talk another day, she said softly. Evan nodded, understanding. As he left, he glanced into the living room. Leo was happily playing the piano for James. The scene gave Evan a mix of feelings, happiness but also worry. Please think about what I said, he told Sophie before leaving. Once Evan was gone, Sophie joined Leo and James in the living room. Leo was still playing, not noticing the grown-ups were feeling a little awkward. So, James said quietly, it seems like things are moving forward with Evan. Sophie sighed. Yes, he's been showing up for Leo, and Leo really likes him. James hesitated before speaking again. Jan, I just want what's best for you and Leo, but are you sure you can trust him after everything? Sophie looked at Leo, who was happily playing the piano. Her face softened. I don't know, James. I really don't. But when I see how happy Leo is with him, I can't take that away from him. James nodded, though he still looked worried. Just be careful, okay? I'm always here for you if you need me. As night fell over Brooklyn, Sophie sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. She thought about how complicated everything had become. Evan was bringing joy to Leo, but also uncertainty. James was a steady, comforting presence, but he reminded her of the life they didn't have together. At the center of it all was Leo. Sweet, innocent Leo, caught in the middle of grown-up feelings he didn't understand. That night, after putting Leo to bed, Sophie lay awake. She promised herself one thing. No matter what happened, she would make sure Leo had the best life she could give him, filled with love, music, and opportunities she never had. With that promise in her heart, she finally fell asleep. The next day was sunny and cool. The trees in Central Park were covered in red and gold leaves. Evan and Leo walked side by side, their hands almost touching, but not quite. It was the first day Sophie let them spend time together without her. She had thought about it for weeks before agreeing. So, what do you want to do first? Evan asked, trying to sound cheerful even though he felt a little nervous. Leo looked around with wide, excited eyes. Can we go to the zoo? Mom said there are penguins there. Evan smiled, relieved to have a plan. Sure, let's go see the penguins. At the zoo, Leo pressed his face to the glass of the penguin habitat. He was fascinated by how funny they looked waddling on land, but how graceful they were in the water. Evan knelt beside him. Did you know some penguins can dive more than 500 meters deep? Leo looked at him, amazed. Wow, that's deeper than the swimming pool at school. Evan laughed. Much deeper, that's for sure. They spent the day exploring the zoo, eating hot dogs and ice cream, and laughing. Evan watched Leo closely, memorizing his smiles and the way his eyes lit up. Later, they sat on a bench near the carousel. Evan looked at Leo thoughtfully. Leo, he said carefully, you know I have a big apartment downtown, right? Leo nodded, still finishing his ice cream. Well, Evan continued, I was thinking maybe you'd like to spend a weekend there with me sometime. There's an extra room, and we could decorate it any way you want. Leo's eyes grew wide. Really? I can choose everything? Evan smiled. Of course, we could paint the walls, pick out furniture, whatever you want. Even a piano? Leo asked, his voice full of hope. Evan felt a lump in his throat. Especially a piano. Leo's face lit up with excitement, but then he frowned a little. But, what about Mom? Will she be alone? The question caught Evan off guard. He hadn't thought about how Sophie might feel. Well, he said slowly, we'd have to ask her first, but I think she'd be happy if you were happy. Leo nodded, thinking hard. Can I think about it? Of course, champ, Evan replied, proud of how thoughtful Leo was. Meanwhile, Sophie was sitting in her apartment staring at her phone. She had promised herself she wouldn't call, but she was worried. James walked in with 2 cups of tea. They haven't called yet? He asked. Sophie shook her head. No, and it's been hours. James handed her a cup and sat down beside her. That's good, Jan. It means they're having fun. I know, Sophie said, taking a sip of tea. But it's hard. For so long, it was just me and Leo against the world. And now you have to share, James said gently. Sophie nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Is it selfish of me to want to keep him all to myself? James put an arm around her. It's not selfish. It's just because you're a great mom. Nothing will ever change that. Sophie leaned into him, feeling comforted. Thank you, James. I don't know what I'd do without you. James smiled, but there was sadness in his eyes. I'll always be here for you, for both of you. Just then, they heard a key in the door. Leo burst in, his face glowing with excitement. Mom, Mommy, we saw penguins and lions and monkeys. Sophie hugged him tightly, her worries fading as she held him close. I missed you, baby. As Leo chattered about his day, Sophie looked at James. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. The road ahead was still unclear, but for now, Sophie felt a little more at peace. Evan walked in right after Sophie, looking tired but happy. Did he behave? Sophie asked, glancing at Leo, who was playing nearby. Evan nodded with a smile. He was perfect. We had such a fun day. James, who had been sitting quietly, stood up. He looked tense. I think it's time for me to go, he said. Evan noticed James for the first time and looked surprised. His smile faded a little. James, I didn't know you were here. James's voice was calm as he said, I just stopped by to see how Sophie is doing. The room felt different now, like something serious was hanging in the air. Leo, too busy talking about his trip to the zoo, didn't notice anything. Sophie tried to make things less awkward. Thanks for looking after him today, Evan. It sounds like you two had a great time. Evan smiled, feeling better. We really did. Actually, there's something I'd like to talk to you about later. Sophie nodded, knowing it was important. Sure, maybe tomorrow. That night in Brooklyn, the little room was full of feelings. Evan was hopeful about the future. Sophie felt torn. She wanted to keep Leo safe, but also let him grow. James was quiet, hiding his feelings, and Leo, happy and innocent, didn't know about the serious emotions around him. At breakfast, Evan sat at the table, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Sophie stood by the sink, looking out at the backyard where Leo was playing. You want a room in this house? Sophie asked, sounding surprised and worried. Evan nodded. Yes. I think it's a great idea. Leo could spend some weekends with me. He'd get to know my family and what? Sophie interrupted sharply. Get fancy things you think I can't give him? No, it's not like that, Evan said quickly. I just want to be in his life more. Sophie sighed. Evan, I understand, but we can't just change Leo's life so fast. He has friends and routines here. This is his home. I get that, Evan replied, but I also want him to know my world. It's not fair to keep him away from half of his inheritance. The word inheritance hung in the air. Sophie's heart sank. She always knew Evan's money would become an issue one day, but not this soon. What about his school? His friends? His piano lessons? She asked. Well, there are amazing schools near my apartment, Evan said. They could really help Leo with his music. Sophie froze. Are you saying you want him to change schools? Not right now, Evan said quickly, but maybe someday. Think of the opportunities. Opportunities. Sophie's voice rose. Do you think he has no opportunities here? We've built a life for Leo in Brooklyn. He has everything he needs. Evan looked hurt. Sophie, I just want what's best for him. And you think I don't? Sophie said, tears in her eyes. Every choice I've made for 5 years has been for Leo. The room went silent. The front door opened and James walked in. He stopped, sensing the tension. I didn't mean to interrupt, James said. No, it's fine, Sophie said. Please stay. She turned to Evan. We'll talk about this later. Evan nodded stiffly and grabbed his jacket. As he walked out, he passed James, and the two men exchanged serious looks. After Evan left, James walked over to Sophie. Are you okay? Sophie wiped her tears. He wants Leo to stay with him on weekends. He's even talking about changing schools. James gave her a comforting hug. Oh, Sophie, I'm so sorry. Outside, Leo ran up to them, holding a shiny stone. Mom, Uncle James, look what I found. Sophie knelt down, forcing a smile. It's beautiful, sweetheart. A real treasure. Leo looked up at her. Mom, are you sad? Sophie hugged him tightly. No, my love. I'm just thinking, that's all. James joined the hug, and they stood there together, a little circle of love. Years later, Leo, now 10, sat in a dressing room adjusting his bow tie. Tonight, he was performing a song he had written himself at a big music competition. Sophie knelt beside him. Remember, no matter what happens, you're already a winner. Leo smiled. I know, Mom. Evan stood nearby, watching them. He felt proud, but also like he didn't quite belong. It's time, said a stagehand. Are you both going to be in the front row? Leo asked nervously. Of course, Sophie said, smiling. Absolutely, Evan added, patting his son's shoulder. Leo walked onto the stage, and the audience went quiet. He sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The song started softly like a quiet sunrise and then grew stronger. It was a mix of sadness and hope, telling a story through music. In the audience, Sophie wiped away tears. Evan sat frozen, listening to every note. James, sitting with a bouquet of flowers, felt his heart ache and heal at the same time. When the song ended, the room was silent for a moment. Then everyone stood up, clapping loudly. Backstage, Leo ran into Sophie and Evan's arms. Did you hear me? I didn't mess up at all. We heard you, Sophie said, her voice shaking. You were amazing. Yeah, champ, Evan added. You surprised us with that song. Where did it come from? Leo shrugged. I guess it came from all of us. James walked over, handing Leo the flowers. You did great, kid. The adults stood together, knowing they had all helped Leo get here. Later that night, while Leo slept, Sophie, Evan, and James stood on the balcony. He's incredible, James said. Sophie smiled. He is, thanks to all of us. Evan looked at them both. Thank you for giving me another chance. James held out his hand. Family isn't just about who you're related to. It's about who's there for you. The three of them looked out at the Brooklyn sky, feeling like they had created something special together. Their family wasn't perfect, but it was full of love, and that was enough. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.